Welcome to the Lights On podcast, featuring stories behind building and running successful hotel businesses. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Lights On podcast. I'm Kin Seo, CEO of Lights On and your host today. On this podcast, we share stories from across hospitality about building and growing hotel businesses. This episode is sponsored by Lights On. Lights On helps hotel grow revenue more consistently by managing pricing, distribution, and digital marketing together. We help hotels identify new revenue opportunities so they don't leave money on the table. We also run the full revenue and marketing operations, so the team on the ground can stay focused on the guest experience. If your hotel needs more revenue growth, visit lightson.co to learn more. Our guest today, Rodger Wada. Welcome. Rodger is the Senior Regional Director of Revenue Management at Springboard Hospitality, one of the leading third-party hotel management companies in the US. Rodger is based in Honolulu and is one of the most respected revenue management professionals in the Hawaii market. He started his career in hotel as a concierge at Sheraton. Then he moved on to operations, front desk operations at Outrigger, then held revenue leadership roles at Highgate, and really worked his way over 20 years of experience in hotel, now leading revenue strategy across some of the Waikiki's most iconic properties. Rodger, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ken. Looking forward to this.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, why don't we start all the way back to the beginning of your career? So concierge at Sheraton, right? So what made you want to make the transition over time to revenue management?
Revenue management came suddenly for me. As I kind of progressed through the operation side. So I started off at concierge. I've done reservation, then I went to front desk, and I was promoted to guest service manager, front office at the airport property, which was under management of Outrigger at the time. And I guess the revenue manager at the time, suddenly departed, and my assistant general manager came up to me and goes, "Hey, I saw you used to be in civil engineering in college, like, so you must be good at math." And I was like, "Yeah, it comes natural to me." And he's like, "You want to try revenue management?" I'm like, I've never been in a discipline before, but if you're confident in me, yeah, sure, I can, take it on and kind of start from there. Like with no background, I just kind of jumped in, and it was challenging because I had no background at the time, but it kind of came very natural to me. Just the whole analytics. It was kind of my second nature. And I don't know, just fell in love with it, and I'm here today.
Okay, coming in by accident and just figure out this is your superpower. That's a great start. What so compared to other folks who might kind of started in the revenue management career, because they might dream about want to be doing analytic, in this industry, right? It's kind of different, right? Like what coming with the operation background, what do you think that makes you unique and different versus somebody who might be starting with a finance or kind of a data background that wouldn't learn from the operational side of things?
Yeah, I think I bring a perspective of a holistic view to how the entire business works, right? When you just kind of come from a background just understanding data analytics, revenue management decision impacts quite a bit on the operation side, right? So like having the understanding and be conscious of what your decision, how it impacts operationally in the overall business, that makes things more seamless, right? When we make a decision in our level in revenue management, like whether it be package or just anything, right? Understanding how does that logistically come through an operation. It just makes things very seamless, less hurdles and challenges. So I think that makes, myself easier to work with a team,
Mm.
and become very cohesive with my colleagues and my partner.
Yeah, interesting. Is there a moment early in your revenue career that your operations background helped you change a decision you would make that a pure finance person would have gotten wrong?
Yeah, I think just like, obviously having the background, I was able to make changes in the SOP of things, of how to do things, right? Sometimes when you're just thinking from on a back end side, like it could make sense from our perspective revenue, but again, it might be a lengthy process on the operation side, right? So when you understand both sides, you can come up with a better solution on
Mm,
how to improve the process versus
understood.
only having that, revenue management only or finance background. So, um, yeah, I
Any,
think understanding operation definitely is a
yeah,
huge positive.
yeah. Any quick example that you could think of that, something that you could, change in the SOP that actually makes sense on both sides of the table?
That's a good question. What comes to my mind first is like how do I used to work in airport, which was very TLA heavy, so it's military people PCSing, and there was a pretty already operation praise because obviously it's pretty extensive at how long they stay and whatnot, and every time when they needed change rates, they just didn't use like correct rate codes and stuff, and they're like, we're just doing it. We're going to use a bar rate because it's easier to do, and I get it, easier to do, right? But obviously that doesn't help out from the analytics side, right? So now that I'm moved into the revenue role, I was able to explain to the staff, hey, I understand this is a difficult process, but we do this for a reason. And before they didn't understand why they did what they did.
Mm,
So because I've done both sides, I was like, okay, I understand this is your process right now. And adding on this, you know, makes your process longer, but there's a reason and
mm,
is to help out our productivity moving forward, right? So by myself understanding how operation works, I was able to explain to the operation team, hey, we're doing this for XYZ reasons, right? And I
mm,
can reciprocate what they're going through, right? So they believe what I say, right? More
yep.
easily, right? They understand where I'm coming from as well. And they understand that I understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
So
So it's,
that's been a great
yeah.
one good example of like, hey, and this was a union property too.
Mm,
So it takes a lot to change an SOP, a process, right?
makes sense.
And you need to get a buy-in from the staff before
Yep.
any changes. So
Yeah. So they are not feeling like just somebody asked to change something, hey, this guy's sitting from the high tower, not knowing what's on the ground.
yeah, because from a staff standpoint, right, it's typically just because, right? We're going to
Mm,
change just because we're not really explained about really the reasons of why. But when you're able to explain that, they get
yeah.
it. Yeah,
Yep.
it's just much seamless, and it builds a good trust between the revenue team and the operations.
Yep, makes sense. And just for listeners for this show who are not familiar with the Hawaii market, so Roger was just mentioning the airport, like the airport Honolulu Hotel, which is like one of the and many hotels are in the market here are unionized. So definitely the labor force, the people, the team on the ground, there will be a different stuff challenges that the revenue team will be working with here. And TLA stands for Temporary Lodging Allowance, which is a U.S. military benefits. Military members, family, when they travel, they can kind of use that as a program, right, to stay at the lodging here. So this is actually a big part of our business for the Hawaii market. Um, this is great. Like getting onto it, it just thinking from that operations background perspective, it kind of almost like giving you a lot of a humbling experience. And I know you like to talk about passion and humility, right? In this game,
Mhm.
like what aside from the operations background, right? What does humility actually look like in the revenue management role?
Um, I think some people have perspective like revenue management right now has what's the right term I would think? I'm trying to think of the right term, but like
Crystal
power.
ball.
It's just because like we have a lot of control, right? But at the same time, we have to be humble. I think that's one of my biggest lessons I've learned, right? Sometimes it's not about just being correct, right? But it's also understanding like different perspective, right? Like operations has, their challenges, marketing has their challenges, sales has their challenges, right? And I think what makes a good revenue leader is to understanding each of those perspective and incorporating all that versus just kind of pushing through your perspective. I think in the beginning I kind of lacked that, to be honest. And I think throughout my career, that's been a big learning lesson for me, and a humility aspect, that made me grow. So uh, that's what
Yeah.
kind of resonate the most with me.
Yeah. Oh, and I think that's a big philosophy that we like some believe into, right? Thinking about different teams operating in silos, right? We just talk about operations, we talk about revenue, but there's also marketing and other aspects. And sometimes they all speak their languages, they're operating in their own world. But I think the true moment of collaborations are when everybody is actually working hand in hand collaboratively, right? I think that really forms the whole, now we talk a lot more about commercial strategy, right? Which is like you can't really put a level on just one perspective. Like, everything has to be plumbed through just kind of what you're talking about, just operations and revenue, right? I think there are just so many things that needs to be translated on both sides. Imagine adding other layers. Now, marketing is in place, now we're talking about, procurements, and supplies and things like that. It just, understanding, I think it is honestly a superpower, especially in the era of AI. You can get something done easily, but how can you explain something clearly so that people who don't know, your background or your work or your discipline actually understand in their language why certain thing needs to be done certain way. I think this is yeah, I think we share that humbling experience, with the work that we do too. So, um, kind of follow up on that, being correct. I know sometimes, buffet and managers, right? We got the myth of like, we need to be like numerically correct, right? Can you give me an example or moment where you know, data sometimes will be telling us one thing, but with what from other discipline, like kind of that humanity aspect, man, like you gotta do something different. Like even though data is telling you a different story.
Yeah, look, it's funny because my first job, and kind of going back to the airport story. Um, I had a incident with my GM, and I don't know if it's good to say this, but and I always tell this story to him, but I think I don't know what the content was. Kind of forgot about that, but I knew that I was presenting something, and based off of that, I was like, no, I think we should go this direction. And obviously, different perspective it discussed, and I'm like, no, I think based on these numbers, I really don't think that's the right way to go. I kind of fought back, and at that time, my communication was very raw, very very direct. And sometimes you have to understand your audience, right? Because in that situation, we had a lot of people in that meeting. And if it's a more closed, audience, right, then they can be more open and more candid. But sometimes it's not always correct to say what's right, right? Sometimes you got to understand your audience. Like, okay, what would happen if I, you know, prove someone or leader wrong in a very not derogatory, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just like there's a lot of people that look up to these leaders, and when you prove them wrong, and then you kind of the trust within the team kind of gets wavered, right? And you're the cause of that, right? So for me, my lesson at the time was like, hey, kind of understand your audience
Yeah.
and you try to say you know what I mean? Like maybe choose a different time to bring things up, or like pull on a side conversation to discuss that. Because also, I remember I did not have the opportunity to even let my leader know about that situation and what my perspective and what the data was. It was that data did come out at that time for the first time, right? So I kind of didn't even give the opportunity to for to kind of people to even know that information. So I didn't think it was fair. Yes, I was correct. Like we saw the numbers on the board, right? I was correct, but that's not the point at times, right? Especially in the industry, right? You're working with people, like you gotta understand the dynamic,
Yeah.
right? And kind of put things in context
Yeah.
because it's so easy to take things out of context in this day
Yeah.
and age.
Just not about being right and wrong. Sometimes I just feel like, back to our personal relationship life, right? Dating and things like that. It's not like it. The goal is not about who's right or wrong, right? It's about,
Mhm.
how everyone is on board to, do and go to a certain direction together, right? I think, yeah, it is, and definitely we saw, and even us personally, we don't make certain some, mistakes like that, right? Hey, number proof it's going to be the right thing to do. But until you get everybody on board to try to do that, you're sputting head. And it turns out it could be less productive, even you have the right answer. When you kind of that stir the pot, everybody just not having a great time, not wanting to collaborate,
Mhm.
it could make things worse.
No, no, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Dang. Okay, so well, let's move the timeline forward a little bit. Let's talk about Courtyard Waikiki Beach. You kind of mentioned just from past, podcasts and all that, you mentioned it's one of the projects that you it's the proudest work that you had, right? Can you walk me
Mhm.
through what you walked into that when you started managing the properties and what you changed?
Yeah. My first day when I arrived at that property, I didn't know my ownership was in town or my asset manager. And that was my first meeting, in person meeting with the asset manager. And I understood the importance of that property succeeding, right? So, and that's the beginning. And, shortly after renovation started, and then when I went through renovation, it's tough to go through renovation. And fortunately or fortunately, yeah, I went through experience of my entire exec team turning over at
Mm.
once. So I don't know how long. I think it was a little less than a month. I was by myself. I was the only exec team left, and I had to pretty much cover each role. Um, and I remember being a point contact, with the asset manager, with the renovation, so all the communications and reports after turning, I got to put that together. My sales team, my DOS wasn't there, so I remember having to do the the Marriott RFP process because I think it was a June, July at the time. Then my housekeeping was gone, so I had to help the housekeeping. And I am definitely not the best, I there's a reason why housekeeping is the one department I was not. It's you know,
You're basically the
um,
GM.
it just I have to, right? Because unfortunately, just in the situation. So, while it was tough, it was my most valuable experience. Like I learned so much, and to this day, I kind of actually appreciate that experience. At that time, I was like, oh my God, like it was tough, but I learned a valuable experience at that time. I have much more appreciation for each discipline, and it was very humbling. You know, as I said, when I first got into revenue, it's like, oh yeah, revenue press all the buttons. made me realize that's not the case. It takes the entire team, really. Everyone says it, right? Oh yeah, it takes a team. That was my humbling and realization that no, it really takes a team to succeed the hotel. Like, yeah, revenue makes important decision, but man, without every player, a hotel is not going to be successful.
Yeah.
So,
Actually, I seeing the real lives after a button is clicked, right? Seeing like that's the actual sausage making process. And if you don't have like perspective on that part, right? To your point, like it could be pretty isolated, just like being a person sitting on a high tower, like who cares about what you said? It's definitely like I can see why humility, right? It kind of like that is a theme for your career and how you, got to where you are. Um, so from that experience, so while you're doing all of the above, right? Basically the GM, let's focus on the revenue and the commercial side of things, right? So at the time, so staff turnover, leadership turnover, renovation is happening, very likely the property is underperforming, right? So in that case, with all these levers that you had to pull as a revenue person, still your main job, right? So how did you balance out, rate, occupancy, like what was the formula or what was that like what kind of principles are you operating at that time to protect the property?
well, it takes a careful crafting of your overall strategy, short term and long term, right? Because we know that if you're too heavy on a short term strategy, you could hurt your rate integrity for the future, right? So really understanding, okay, from what point to what point are you going to be aggressive at rates? For example, go after occupancy, right? So really just understanding, okay, so we're renovation too, right? It's all about rebranding, right? The messaging, the PR, and understanding when you start pushing your rates up, right? And so that was really important. Because people get comfortable. Once you start dropping your rates, you get your occupancy right. Owners are kind of okay for the moment with the cash flow coming in. It's easy to get really comfortable with that, right?
Yeah.
But and that's where you gotta be disciplined,
Yep.
right? Okay. I know it's getting comfortable, but okay, we need to kind of flip that switch somewhere. And of course, then you gotta involve everyone, right? Okay, operationally, what needs to improve first, right? Like, which is a guest service score, right? And that's why there's a huge emphasis on, all right, let's start pushing rates when that score goes up. Because obviously renovation time, the scores are down because of noise complaint, et cetera, right? So obviously that's a gauging point too. So we choose certain reference point of, okay, after XYZ starts to improve, then we can start pushing our rates, right? Or if sales is able to start increasing their, starting getting those corporate business back, right? With Marriott, especially, right? They go away for a while when you're going through renovation and they start slowly coming back. So it's really working closely with each of your team, right? And kind of make sure, okay, what measurement are we going to start pushing the rates, right? With sales productivity, operationally, so that's been very important in the
Yeah.
overall strategy.
Yeah, and I appreciate you kind of mentioning that guest score, the guest service score, right? Especially like to your point, going down is easy. Now trying to inching your rate back up like one step at a time, that's the hardest, right? So, and I feel like sometimes it's hard, right? Like from a owner perspective, right? They always say, hey, I need higher ADR, but like that if you just tune up the rate, like people are not going to be upset. And okay, now why the heck are you doing that? Like what additional value or what additional experience are you creating to justify the increase, right? What are the small things that people tend to overlook aside from guest service, right? Like that will be critical to push up your ADR.
People think this is intangible, but it is like tangible. It's actually managing expectations,
Mm.
right? We understand when you come on a renovation, you want a big boost, but it just depends on the market, right? And let's be specific with the Waikiki market, right? Or Honolulu, right? There's literally 70, 80 other hotels, right? So there's competition. So of course you have to first understand the market because it's very saturated, right? Right. So understanding your market, wherever you are, understanding your market, understanding competitors, and how do you fit into that equations, right? And from there, um, we got to understand it got to be kind of gradual, right? This popping your rates because the first thing you got to do, as I said, and that's where the guest service score is very important, right? Because that shows kind of value, right? It shows you, okay, how are you different from your other properties or other competitors, right? And that's where people are willing to pay the price, where the price is, right? But if you just go all the way from like, I'm just throwing an arbitrary number, but $100, $200, that's a huge jump, right? But we know that realistic, that's what happens, right? And even though your product should be 200, you still gotta kind of,
It's
gradually
not
go up.
binary. It has to be the
Yeah.
ladder up to that level.
I
And
like you said binary, it's not 0, 1,
yeah,
right? It's
yep,
not 0, 1, right? So, but that's it, that's kind of how it's perceived though, right? Because so when you're not in the market, you don't understand, people that's the perspective. It's like it's 0, 1. It's either I'm a budget property or I'm this elevated boutique property, right? So there's an in between and there's a process, right? And I think we need to understand the importance of that process to get to your goal, all right? Because the expectation is I want that process to be as minimal as possible and just go from 0 to 1 real quick.
yeah.
Right.
It looks as easy as like on the spreadsheet, right? Because when you don't know, to your point, if you don't
Mhm.
know what happens after the button clicking, if you're purely looking at the Excel spreadsheet, right? Going from one column to another, it's just like, okay, now this month going to next month, it
Mhm.
definitely could feel binary.
No, no, it really does, right? And that's the reason why communication is very important, actually. I think that's the most important aspect of thing is, right, it's actually a living thing, we think of because it's based on human behavior.
Yep.
That's what our industry is actually about, is human behavior, actually, right? And there is infinite factor that could affect how we produce,
Yeah.
right? So really understanding those aspects, those factors, and letting everyone know why are things happening, the way they are. And that's actually our job as revenue
Yeah.
management, actually, right? To really understand that and translate it. And see what the best course of action is to reach to your goal. And sometimes it might be the long way around, but that might be the best course. So,
Yeah. Well, taking that to a hypothetical scenario, right? Like if let's say you're stepping into a new hotel you're going to manage that
Mhm.
commercially is underperforming. So let's say you have to come in and do the evaluation and thinking about the next course of actions. What are the first three things you will look at?
The first thing I will look at is how do we produce historically? I need to look at the historical production, right? And really look at, by market segment, by channel, how we're producing the behavior, like how did we change our rates previously, right? And from there, um, I put together, I call it algorithm,
Mm,
right? I have a hypothesis of, okay, what competitors really affect me, what price range, and how do I want to move my price range according to the market and the competitor, right? So I have a hypothesis. Okay, I think this is where I need to be between, and depending on the demand, right, and your internal compression, like how much more I can push, right? Because what I notice a lot when I jump into new property is, interesting enough, people have a cap, right? Especially in a budget property, like, oh, because I'm a budget property, I can't go over this rate.
mm,
And many times I've exceeded that,
mm.
right? So without I take off all like, the initial, let's just say, thoughts, expectations, um, and just kind of test it out. I need to see it for myself, test out my hypothesis, and then kind of go from there. But obviously, in order to do that, I need to study my historicals, my datas, in every perspective I can, right?
Yep.
Rather, and one thing I get missed a lot is actually upsells.
Mm.
I think it's very important to study that too, like because people just worry about the entry level pricing and they don't look at their upsell at all,
And
right?
just and this is not just about room upgrades, right? Are you talking about just any sort of ancillary
Utilization,
revenue?
yes.
Mm.
You're because a lot of times the higher tier category goes, there's less and less production, right? And you end up just upgrading. And that's where a big opportunity is,
Mm.
right? And really understanding your source of your business, right?
Yep.
Like where are these people coming from,
Yep.
right? Is it a drive-in, right? And in Hawaii there is no drive-in, right? Technically speaking, so that's why it makes Hawaii very much more complex.
Mm.
Because technically we are a finite demand. It just
Yep.
depends on the airlift. But anyways, kind of understanding your source of your business, in learning that source too. Let's, for example, Hawaii, we get 40% of our flight comes from California,
Mm.
right? So we want to understand how does California people travel, right? Um, and we start realizing and right now in the market is the booking window is so short. These people are willing to book in the day for the day, which is completely different from pre-COVID.
Yep.
And I bring it up specifically because, for people I speak to a lot, right? They still talk about year-over-year pace. I'm not saying that's not an important data point, and I'm not saying it's totally obsolete, but definitely don't want to make that our only source of like indications,
Yeah.
is that could lead to missteps.
Yep.
So just really understanding every aspect. So when you're looking at talking about pace, for example, I want to know my last 3-day pickup pace, 7-day, 1 month, last quarter, right? Like you're gonna need more granular, not just looking at overall data points, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I do.
Yep.
Understand.
Yeah. So sorry to cut you off, but I will let you finish and I'll ask my follow-up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So first is understand, study the data, then put together algorithm, right? Okay, what you want to do, what you want to implement, um, and then from there, distribution. Distribution is important, like understanding how it's set up, because typically, when something's not going right, there's something wrong in your system, right? So it's you really have to learn your system.
Yep.
Fundamental is so important. Like, so if you don't know your system well, you gotta first learn your system, right? Whether it be Synexis, whether if you're in a brand like a Marriott system, like you have to learn the system. If you don't know your system, then you cannot fully optimize your property. So
Yeah.
you gotta know your system.
Yeah. We actually just
Those are the
did a
basics.
we actually just did another recording with Dan Waxman, actually a local consultant, and the owner of the platform Hawaii Hotel Hui. So he actually did lots of consulting for technology stack audits, selection, and all that. Uh, One golden nugget he kind of talks about was like coming in, and this is from both revenue and cost perspective, right? Audit your system, understand your system, getting all the contracts, knowing how much you're paying for them. Are you actually utilizing all of the features, right? Because on the cost side of things, you might be paying all these costs that you don't even utilize. I think that's one big cost saving from a bottom line perspective. The other
Mhm.
part is like to your point, if you don't know like your system, what they're capable of, what leads to what kind of like, distribution channels that you have, you might be leaving money on the table too, right? So yeah, it's such an important aspect that, people tend to miss because like, when it comes to technology, people think it's like outside of their job description.
Mhm. Mhm. No, because we always talk about technology, um, and this is a lot of magic company actually. I'm not knocking any magic company. Just I think we kind of lose the emphasis on training. It's
Mm.
actually really right to that point because like yeah, we a lot of us know a good part of how to utilize our system, but I don't think a lot of us say, oh, like I know 100% how to utilize every aspect of Synexis, for example, right? Um, but if we do, like we could, yeah, pull a lot more levers than what we even knew. So, just an example. Like I do think investing in each of the players is important.
Yeah, actually, since we are on the topic of technology, actually something more specific about Springboard, the company that you work at right now, and and just one thing I want to confirm before my next question, because I saw a case study about PTG Consulting helping Springboard to standardize the whole technology stack across all the independent properties. Is that still the case? Do you guys working with a same technology stack across different properties right now?
That's our goal. That's our goal.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Obviously, with different properties, different market, sometime for a 500 key hotel versus a
Mm,
100 key hotel, right? Um, there's different investments, right, you want to do. So unfortunately, not everyone can, have the same, system, but
mm,
as much as possible, yeah, it's because it makes it more seamless, right? To implement strategies, right? As I said, like the more you know about your systems, more efficient you could be. So I do think it's an important strategy to um kind of utilize the same product for other properties.
mhm.
And I think a lot of magic companies are doing that, it's just much
Yeah.
more efficient.
Yeah, and to your point, and it could be a philosophical question, right? Knowing that, especially in the independent space, right? When many hotels, shape or form, the product could be so different. Thinking about standardizing that, um, obviously, like what are the biggest challenges? And the other part is that truly the right thing to do for, again, different products?
Yeah, and I face, especially when we're talking about, bottom line, right? Your EBITDA. So when we say standardize, I think people start thinking, oh, we have to use the same system. I'm just going to throw out there the main ones are Opera and SynXis, right? Does every single property needs to use Opera or SynXis? No, I think when we say standardize, like, okay, if you fall into this type of hotel independent, then maybe this is the most efficient system. If you
Mm,
fall in this type of, properties, maybe, SiteMinder or whatever out there could be, your standard, right? So, I do kind of want to clarify that, like, each type of property, could be more efficient and cost efficient when I say
mm,
that, cost efficient, so I think it's important for us to understand each of the product too, the technologies out there, right? I think that's also an important part too. I think a lot of companies are just like, no, we're just going to use this one system, right? And we're going to roll out to every single property. But then that kind of defeats the independent aspect because the
mm.
whole point of independent is being unique, being
Yep.
flexible, right? Being able to navigate quickly versus a more stagnant, brand, for example, right? So I think when you start saying like, well, every independent has to be this way, it takes out that advantage, I think, from an independent property. So I think there should be a certain level, right?
Mm.
Like certain independent this, certain independent this, So I
Yeah.
think,
Well, let's talk about the universal standardized language, for hotel, right? Top line and bottom line. I think this is the part where it's tend to be more aligned, but not so much, especially in revenue management. Because I think for the longest time, I think to this day, lots of people, lots of professionals, there are emphasis still on the top line, the RevPAR and all that, versus, what I noticed you just mentioned a lot about the bottom line, right? The GOP, the net operating income, like these are like truly what an operator, what an asset manager, what an owner would care about, because this is like money getting to the bank account. Um, how is that? I still feel industry in general is still kind of lagging behind on that concept. Um, how do you think about that, and what do you think that the challenges to keep revenue professionals from thinking about uh the bottom line like an owner?
you know, um, I've always been about EBITDA, NOI, right? Understanding it. I mean, look, to be honest, that's kind of been a challenge too, right? Especially when you're bringing in new people in the industry, right? Looking at P&L, that should be the first thing, right? I don't care what division you are, sales, GM, revenue. End of the day, we're managing an owner's, their asset, right? And the important thing is EBITDA, right? And also understand the NOI because like of course, like depending on their investment, right? Interests are different, right? I'm not saying that's our job, but I feel in this competitive market, the more you understand that and can communicate the ownership in that level, the more trust you'll get.
Mm.
So I've always looked at the bottom line, right? Understanding what the impact is going to be, right? Because yeah, to your point, when I first started, it was so easy. Oh yeah, let's just, inflate our rate, add all these packages, free breakfast, free this, free that. And then when a P&L come up, is like, why is my in my service recovery line, which typically goes to, right? Like, why is my expense line so huge? Like that's versus the budget, right? That's the first question that's going to come up, right? So I think it's a difference between experience. I think experience, director of revenues, they're in these ownership meetings and they know that gets questioned. So they're more careful in crafting these, different type of strategies and promotions and
Mm.
packages. And so with the sales too, like, yeah, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to sell a consortium rate with this agency at a very high rate, but okay, we don't think about GDS cost, we don't think about the reservation cost through RCRS and commission, and typically those are way resort fee, right? So yeah, I think end of the day, the most important thing is GOP par actually,
Mm.
or even more. Yeah, actually, if there's such thing, EBITDA par,
Yeah.
right? What is your true bottom line? Like, how does it affect the whole bigger picture? Um, and I think we need to strategize accordingly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all should be on the same page on that, to be honest.
Yeah, well, and think about in between, right? I think everyone needs to take the first step from thinking just to pure top. I think in between top line to bottom line, there's still something in the middle, right? I think you kind of mentioned the distribution cost, right? The cost of acquisitions through a certain channel. How do people like? How should people think about that? Because that obviously start getting into my question into the OTA versus direct versus all the different distribution channel, right? A huge Pandora box that we are opening right now. But yeah, how do people should think about that to start with cost of acquisition?
First, they need to understand that there's cost
Yeah,
in each channel, in each
even
distribution.
direct, even
Even
direct.
direct. Yeah, even direct. No, no, really. They need to and to be honest, to your point, I don't think a lot of people do. Right. And I think is man, I am gonna probably open a Pandora box by saying this, but because we're not incentivized, right? Um, we're just kind of incentivized within our own discipline, but end of the day, right? Is that helping out our ultimate goal, right? So I'm gonna kind of leave it there, but at the end of the day, right, we're here to try to make our ownership happy, right? I mean, that's our ultimate goal as a team, and I think it is important to understand that, and actually, it is important to understand it because then you can start, for example, like with direct, like a lot of people just be like, "Oh, I'm the Hawaii market, just come on and bar, and that's it," right? Maybe membership, right? But it's like, okay, well, how much does it really cost to get that OTA booking, for example, right? And when you understand that cost, then you realize, oh, there's a lot of playing space actually on a direct path,
Yeah,
right? Um, Another part too that people talk about, oh, okay, well, OTA is very expensive. And I'm like, no. They're like, what do you mean? And I'll be like, people don't realize GDS channel is actually very expensive. We don't see that, especially in a brand too, because when you look at brand, that gets lumped up in your invoice. I don't know what typically line that is, but it gets lumped up. So people don't even really know unless you ask for a detailed
yep.
invoice. You have to manually ask that, right? So even from a brand standpoint, they don't get it like, oh yeah, Marriott gets all these direct, but when it comes to GDS channel, I want to,
Devil's
yes,
in the detail.
yeah. So every time we talk about like costs, right? People always talk about direct, independent hotel, but even from a brand standpoint, there's cost in there. Is just we don't look at it. A lot of us, right, don't look at it in depth, or even the GMs. Um, yeah. I learned it from one GM that I worked under before, and that's why I nailed this. But yeah,
But
it's important.
until you learn, like you knew kind of that level of details, right? Even like looking at the pure P&L, you don't see that breakdown, then you just assume, right? And that, wrong assumption is like almost like the master of, all devils. Uh, yeah, it just like, especially in a rougher time like what we are facing right now, just, thinking about every single way that you can pull your lever to, not just increase the incremental revenue, but also thinking about things that you can reduce costs with, then I think just thinking about distribution, it has to be part of the whole revenue strategy discussion because I think many times people still think about these are kind of two separate disciplines when they're not. Like almost, we have um professionals. Actually, Bernard Tan from Castle. We're gonna have a show with him very soon. He now talks about revenue management is all about distribution. I think that kind of stuck with me for a while.
Yeah, you know what my ultimate ask for this new AI, and I'm surprised we don't have it today, is how do we, because right now let's just say you have a BI, right? Well, from revenue management, it's all top line, right? But if we can seamlessly incorporate all the costs associated by rate code level, let's say, I think that's going to change a lot of perspective, and I think that's the future in technology for let's just call it hotel management, right?
Yeah,
Because it's not even revenue anymore. I think we it'll be important for us to evolve our discipline to really from commercial. We call it commercial, right? We put it together. Yes, it's important to collaborate between revenue, marketing, and sales, but finance needs to come into that because at the end of the day, we can't make a decision that's going to be costly,
yep,
literally and figuratively, right? So
exactly.
I think we always think finance and revenue is separate when it's together.
Yeah,
I mean, I work with my finance team so close, and I don't know. I just think I personally think it's imperative, but
yeah. It is a challenge to break down silos, right? Because even many commercial teams today, we can even break down the silos between marketing and revenue. Now, like finance, it's like way down the road, right? I think it's always setting up that right strategy and goal so that people can all walk towards that, talking about communications, everybody talking about the common language. I think those are all really good starting point, right? But I think that less about the discipline, but more about just commercially, like everyone working at the same property, they all have a say, like in the commercial strategy of the hotel. To your point, hotel management is not just revenue management or whatever management, right? So,
Mhm.
um, so branded versus independent. Because you mentioned that when talking about GDS, how and you had experience for both. How how different is the approach, especially for distribution for brand versus independent, and where the show is for a lot of independent hoteliers, right? How like what are the things that independent hotels still leave the most money on the table compared to their branded competitors?
I think where branded does a great job and we people become brand is the membership, right? I
Mm,
mean, that's the biggest difference, right? The following. That's what the independent lack. Um, but the problem right now, and I don't know if it's a trend, but people are leaving the brand because it's just so saturated now, right? I feel like it's confusing. There's so much sub brands, soft brand within the brand, and you don't even know what brand that is. There's so much new brand right now. I feel like it's no different from an independent, right? But I think that's been kind of a challenge for independent is the following, right? The repeat customers. That's where the independent leaving money. And I think a lot of independent property are trying really hard. And that's the reason why OTA comes in, because OTA has that following, right? They have a lot of members. Um, if there's a way independent property can have a membership program that's sustainable, which I don't know. And there's third party membership, right? Oh, we joined this membership program, and there's a lot of other independent in that, right? There's a lot of companies out there, but um, yeah, I think independent will be much more successful. But again, that's a reality today. Is that's why there's brand, that's why they're independents, and of course, with that said, it's because there's a following because there's more bigger return for consumers with brand, right? They
Yeah.
get points, free
Yep.
state status, right? Feel good, right? With the status, like they get catered more, right? Special service.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a big challenge with independent, obviously, I think.
Yeah. But to your point, the repeat guests, right? Yes, independents, they don't have the luxury of building that brand, which is a whole bunch of people like putting a flag on their properties. But it doesn't mean like it is free for all, right? I think just that strategy on repeat guests, right? Yes, many independents they have to rely on OTA to get the guests to even like discover the hotel. But once the guest comes to your property, like you can really own that journey. You can really wow this guest to get them want to come back again. And you acquire this guest through OTA the first time, you better have them book direct the second time. And I don't think any independent properties like they there's no excuse for them to not to wow the guests to make them feel, oh, like I feel very compelled as a guest to I come back, and this time I'm gonna be have that direct relationship with the property. So I think like those are what people should be thinking about versus not just like, oh, I'm not a brand, I give up, right?
Yeah, and I say that kind of blanketly when I say
Yeah,
that, but independent could easily get return consumer. It's
yeah,
it's actually about being a one of a kind.
yeah,
Um, I think we always say that kind of cliche actually, but it's really important.
yeah,
When you can provide something unique, you are gonna become Instagrammable. You're gonna, like you're gonna attract attention because, you're one of a kind.
yeah,
Um, and to be honest, a lot of independent property to this day, um, I think it's just because of lack of, how would I say it? Different type of GCs, construction companies, especially Hawaii, for example, even mainland too, right? So, every property kind of becomes similar,
mm,
right? No one's fault. I mean, this day and age, it's expensive right now, construction, right?
yeah,
So it's hard to become unique, but that's a big challenge, right? So how do you be cost effective and unique? That's $1 million question,
yeah,
it's easy to pour money a lot and be unique, but um, and that's where I think we get tested as a management company.
yep,
How do we become unique, whether it be the actual product or service, thinking outside the box. Um, yeah, I think that's so I earlier I said brand, right, is easy to get returning, but independent can.
yep,
It might be a little bit harder, but
yep. It's harder, but not impossible.
no,
And yeah,
not at all. Not at
yeah.
all.
And in fact,
Um,
there are actually some great pointers from our past episodes. So Brent Shiratari, the previous global brand director at Outrigger, we actually did a great recording talking exactly about that aspect of how do you how does somebody cost effectively building that uniqueness and the brand story, right? So just for the listeners, going back to the episode with brand story, there's actually some tips and tricks that someone can think about. So man, Roger, all this knowledge so much so far, they're just so great. I feel like I have to bring you back at some point for another episode because I still got like a long list of questions I want to ask you. But
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
yeah, but we should start kind of getting to kind of the last bit of the show here. Um, just thinking about back to the theme of humility and thinking about new people coming to the industry, to this discipline of revenue management, commercial strategy, right? If you could give one piece of advice to someone earlier in the career, thinking about maybe you 15, 20 years ago, right? What's something that you wish the younger Roger would know before he started?
Yeah, I mean, one thing there's three things. One thing is really focus on a fundamental, like really understand why you're doing what you're doing, right? Not just like learn the process, but once you really understand the whys, and that sounds like cliche, but I think it is no matter which actually industry you go to, I think is very important. I think right now people are just so comfortable just learning the process and kind of going by their day. But if you really want to progress, I think that's important. Two, it's passion. Um, if you don't have passion, no matter how good you are, um, and for basketball fans, I think like Kobe Bryant
Mm,
is one of that, right? Like he's not the most talented, like from a potential and talent standpoint, but like the passion, I think he had the most passion amongst anyone, right? I think that's why he was able to get to where he is. Um, and I think no matter which industry you go, I think that's so important. You can be the most gifted, smartest person, most analytical person, but if you don't have the passion and want to learn things, and the drive, um, you're probably not going to get too far.
mm,
And lastly, as we've been talking about being humble. That's been my challenge. I always say I'm a humble person, which certain aspect I was, but there is different levels and aspects of humility and humbleness, and yeah, just always being a mindset. I always have space to improve, no matter where you are in a career, and be open to learn, and I'll listen. Um, they always tell you, right? Don't just hear things, like actually listen and try to understand. I mean, like whoever's talking, it might not be all 100% correct, but there's got to be some wisdom in that, and try to get that portion out,
yeah.
right? So I think we're always so quick to judge, be like, oh, now, like for example, like at a situation where a salesperson was speaking about revenue, most people are like, nah, man. Don't talk to revenue about revenue. Like we know what we're doing, but sometimes you have different perspective and they might make you realize things. So don't just brush it off. Like, be always open to those conversations, right? And yeah, just always be open to learn.
Yeah.
I think that's what got me far, to be honest.
This is so great. Who um who is your biggest champion in your professional career, and what did you learn from this person that form your philosophy?
I actually think about that a lot, and I actually have two people, if you don't mind.
Let's go for
Uh,
it.
yeah, uh, one of one individual's name is Sean Usami, and he's been my mentor, not just professionally, but personally as well, right? And I think he's the one that really taught me to, yeah, kind of just always be humble and always be open to learn. Um, so yeah, I think I thought I understood what he was saying now. It took the second individual, his name is Yohei Egashira. he was a tough boss at time, and we're like really good friends. But he was kind of reason why I'm where I am today too. I was able to change because I was a really stubborn individual. Still am at certain things, but I became so much more open to like changing the ways and it's good to be in your own ways, obviously, have your own personality, but yeah, just to learn when to be yourself and when to learn and change.
Mm.
If I didn't have these two individuals being my mentor and leader, I would not be where I am today. And I'm very appreciate them for being part of my life today.
Wow. That's so great. And Sean and Yohei are being, some of the other legends in this market. We gotta somehow get them onto the show too. Roger, where can people learn more about you?
That's a good question. I don't play a whole lot in social media, but feel free to, email me. I'm always open to, networking and, catching up. And so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we will put Roger's the appropriate contact information in the show notes. So I don't want people to spam you, but we will find something that works so that people can reach out to you. All right, Roger, it's been so great talking to you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yep.
Thanks for listening to the Lights On podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.